Good afternoon and welcome into the Takeup. Today we have episode 142, Q&A, embroidery analysis and patch production pros and cons. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the Take Up. Happy to have you here for this Education Friday. Time to talk about embroidery, digitizing, and everything in the world of apparel decoration because I will sometimes venture into that world of business and e commerce and value and everything involved. And we'll have some of that today as well. But today is mostly for answering questions. I've had some questions coming in that are kind of interesting. In the last little while, coming back from the trade shows, coming back from doing that stuff and getting out there live talking to people means that I most certainly have things that people have asked me that I want to get to that I think should be interesting. Now, we had a couple technical difficulties. I'm going to go ahead and let you guys know. Sometimes that happens, but today in specific, we've had some technical issues. So I'm trying to go ahead and get that sorted out for you. So I apologize for the slightly late start, but hopefully we should be good and connected and going for the rest of the episode for the rest of the afternoon. Suffice to say, might be a little shorter show. We'll try and keep it tight, but I do want to talk about these different things we discussed. Like, I'll bring back up the thumbnail one more time so you can see what we were talking about. Embroidery analysis. So, what do I mean by embroidery analysis here? People were asking me, how do I tell what stitch types things are when I'm looking at them? They were looking at some specific pieces, some fashion pieces from folks that they wanted to emulate, and they wanted to discuss, how do I tell what stitch types are? How do I figure out how to make that thing? And there's some stuff that we can discuss about how we look at embroidery. It's something I've talked about before, analyzing or seeing stitches in embroidery. And we'll discuss that for a bit and show some actual samples of what they were looking at so I can tell you what I think some of the problems are with that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about patch production pros and cons. In specific, I had some folks ask me why people use the different methods they do for producing small run patches and why does one or the other make sense. And in fact, one of them was because I've shown them stitch only patches or thread only patches, and I'll talk about those again. Why would anyone do that? Because they have a very high stitch count, and I've actually got some reasons for that. So we'll talk about all that as we go on, but I also want to hear from you guys live. If you have some questions, some comments, you want to talk about this stuff, feel free to jump in live. Keep it civil, keep it light, keep it nice, but definitely tell us the straight dope on how you handle your patches. And also, when you're analyzing embroidery, what is it that you look for and how do you work about emulating them? Because we're going to talk about a little bit about that too, about how we start trying to replicate things. So we'll discuss that. But first and foremost, as I usually do, though I love you guys in the hashtag replay squad who come in and watch this stuff later, I like to say hi to the folks who are here live. So I'm going to take a minute and do that real quick. We have Cindy, who is apparently happy to be here. Love that you're here, Cindy. Happy to have you in. Kingsbury Crass is in. We have Joanne saying hello and happy Friday. Happy to have you in. Frank from over in the UK, awesome community sharer and helper. Frank, happy to have you in as well. Marta is in from Texas. And Ramona says, my half Monday is still progressing too. Yeah, we've had just an entire day full of kind of technical issues with our streaming, technical issues in general. And I've actually had some connection issues due to my local provider having some work done in my area. So we'll have to see how that pans out. But, hopefully we're doing well and we'll hold on together and get this out and done. But I will say this is the most Monday Friday I've had in a while. And that's not just because I've got more work to do this weekend. Marcos is in from Arizona. Marcos, happy to have you in. Frank on 2 channels. And we'll go ahead and have our first comment from Joanne. Love to see these. I recently made a big batch of patches and have more to make. They are a fun item to embroider. I am a big fan. Love making patches. There are people who certainly are more, dyed in the wool patch folks than I am, but I very much love patches and emblems and have a long time been a proponent of bringing small run patches into your shop for so many reasons. They are so able to help you with different things. Now, it's not just the patch hats, which have now become popular, but in my early days where it was anathema, you couldn't make a patch hat for someone because they thought of it as, funny enough, old school, too retro, too dated. And now that the quote unquote dated look of the seed corn trucker hat is exactly what we're referring to again today. So we'll be talking about that. But yeah, love that stuff. But let's go ahead and talk to some of the folks who are here before I get on a tear about patches and how versatile they are for decoration, which may or may not happen during the course of this hour or so. Mike saying hello. Hello, Mike. Happy to have you in. Rich is in. And we have everybody saying hi to each other, which I love. You guys are a community, and I just enjoy it. Mike says, not sure I can go through all the 100 ways I make patches in a live comment. Love it, Mike. Now, Mike has made some incredible, cool stuff, including some padded military emblems. Incredibly cool stuff that you did a lot of experimentation on. Love that stuff. Love to see that work. And by the way, people who experiment, close to my heart, because you guys are really making it work and doing the actual scientific style testing that I always promote in order to figure out how things work and to make those standard procedures that make that work. You might have 100 ways, but I bet you all 100 of them work, the ones that you use, and you've got a favorite. Tell me your favorite to make patches, Mike. Carol says, my first live take up. Hi from Montana. Happy to have you in, Carol. Thank you for joining us live. We also have everybody, like I said, saying hi to each other. Love that. Gary's coming from North Texas. First nice day in 4 days. I sure hope it gets better for you guys. I know lots of you having hard times with your power out. Uh, really hoping it gets better for you folks out in Texas. Lots of lovely folks down there. And Mike says, replicating patches, though, high resolution scans, or so my digitizer or me can see how the provided samples were stitched. Had to do this lots for the padded military patches. Yeah, high res scans. The great thing is, we are living in a time where either for product placement or for other reasons, people have high res scans available. And what I love is doing vintage stuff. I've been teaching vintage embroidery styles or how to break out of modern styles of embroidery and stitch types. And part of that has been trying to get people to look at more vintage embroidery, even if you're not looking at museum samples, which often have really nice high resolution photography. The great thing is you can go look at vintage embroidery because it's being sold in vintage clothing markets or on eBay or on Etsy. And frequently they have incredibly high res pictures of them where we can get in close and see stitches. So yeah, get out there and just consume some embroidery, folks. I really love that. It really is the way to go. But yeah, love that stuff. Uh, Joanne saying, I created the patch using the Dime patch application maker software, use patch twill. Yeah, that's a good way to do it. You know, I really like some of the stuff. Honestly, you guys know I work for Brilliant, so I like the stuff that we're doing with Merrily. I love the stuff that the embroidery nerds are doing. They've Jeff's got his faux Marrow edge stitch, so I've really been enjoying all of the variations of that going on. We're doing it, like I said, in Brilliance with Merrily and with Stitch Artist 3, which I'm going to show you a piece from that. Love the vintage edge, but I made a ton of just straight up satin edge patches in my time. There's nothing wrong with a satin edge patch, and if you go to real emblem companies, they make them too. I just really right now I'm loving the texture. I just really have always wanted to do the faux Marrow edge patch, and now that I have a tool that does it very nicely, I really do like it. But yeah, everybody's got their own favorites, but I love all of them. And yes, it's okay, Joanne, to mention names. It's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Everybody's got a place here. You guys have often seen me show. I show the stuff in Brilliance that I work on. I show the stuff in Wilcom. It was the software that I used for most of my career. I've even showed some stuff that was out of other people working in Design Shop or Pulse, and I've worked in all of the above. I think we all have the software we work on. You guys know who I work for and what I love because I got to develop it. Or work on developing it. I wasn't the developer, but I was somebody who worked on that process. So I have, of course, I got a dog in the hunt. But at the same time, I want you guys to work with whatever software you have. Plus, I'm going to be honest with you, most of us have more than one. You know, that's often the case when you have special features that are only existing in some pieces, like the faux Marrow edge that is only with the automatic cornering in Stitch Artist 3. It doesn't exist anywhere else aside from Marrow and Stitch Artist 3. I know tons of people who run multiple softwares. We got no problem with that. We're here for the education. And Brilliance does give me the right to go ahead and do this stuff and gives me the space so I can teach even when I'm working, and that's wonderful. So thanks to them and thanks to their products. And I do show their products when I think that it has merit, but I show everybody's products because ultimately what's important about embroidery is the knowledge of the stitch. It's the knowledge of embroidery itself. Now, I would love for you to try out our cool stuff we build because I'm invested and I love it and I think it works well. It's stuff that I really enjoy. But I'm not here to sell you something. I'm here to teach you about embroidery and talk about it. That is what we do. All right, so we got a couple more people in. So, yep, Joanne says, love vintage looks. Absolutely. Vintage embroidery is awesome. And I'll just say one thing, break out of using big flat fills. That's one of the big things about embroidery that has changed over the years is the texture of a big flat tatami style fill is very different. But I'm just going to say, yeah, I do love that stuff. And one of the things I really enjoy about getting to teach is saying, hey, just because we have a big area that needs to be filled with stitches, we don't just have to fill it with one set of stitch types in one angle. And the vintage stuff really shows us that. And there's lots of wonderful hand-guided stuff. Creative and Brilliance, Brian Bailey brought in some cool vintage stuff, and I'm not showing it today, but got to see like a vintage post-wear Sukajan jacket that he brought in. It's something that I taught from, and seeing people's work, what they did mostly with hand-guided zigzag style machines, the way that they filled space is really inspirational and cool. And Lisa, who's currently teaching in Atlanta, Georgia right now, teaching a bunch of awesome stitch artist folks. Love that stuff. Greetings from Atlanta, she says, was singing your fabulous digitizing skills in class. Have a great show. Thank you for tuning in. And I know you guys are having a great show out where you are. You're having a great class because people have your expertise to lean on. You've made some incredible stuff yourself, Lisa. So thank you for bringing that up. Faux marrow is really cool. Thanks, Joanne. And last thing from here, Joanne says, long ago I worked in a uniform company. I had patches with the real marrow edge. There was a husband and wife team, did all the embroidery and marrow and sold to the uniform company. Love it. Love it. So, yeah, like I said, it's something that I really enjoy. I love the marrowed edge. I love the faux marrowed edge. I love vintage patches. I love all of this stuff. And one last comment. Lisa says, excited to do my first round of patches next week. Love learning from all the geniuses in the group. Fantastic. Yeah, honestly, that's what we're here for. That's what we're here for. We're here to get together, to teach each other, and to learn. But let's start talking about this stuff, right? We've got some fantastic stuff that we're all discussing today, I think, because I really like the concept of analyzing embroidery that exists out there. I'm going to show you some different examples of things and we'll discuss it. But, when we're talking about analyzing embroidery, it sounds heavy, right? I always use these very scientific terms. The joke is always the 50-cent words. When you used to get paid by the word to write for magazines back in the very olden days, I always make the joke that these are my 50-cent words. They're paid by the character. They're usually long and ponderous and complicated. I talk like that. But embroidery analysis, the better way to say this is probably seeing in stitches. So seeing stitches, that's what we're actually talking about when we're saying embroidery analysis. The reason I call it analysis is I think that there's a little bit more to it than that. We're not just going to write down some things we see as we're looking at our embroidery. We actually have to say, here are the different qualities that stitches have that we can take cues from. Because when we're trying to analyze something for replication or for inspiration, hopefully you're not just trying to replicate somebody else's piece. Hey, but that can be part of the learning process. I'm going to say I've done many, many articles on the process of what I call retail research, which is going and looking at at the high street, at the box stores, at the fashion world, and looking at what's available, seeing the stitches, and then taking that inspiration to something else. Usually, like what I like to do is say I start with I say mash it up and sleep on it, which sounds funny, but the concept is we want to take inspiration from one place and a topic or a design style from another place, put those things together that were not together before. So we're looking at our styles and stitch types and colors from one place, and then maybe we use a different format. Like this was looking at an original piece that was a bunch of stuff for like resort wear or souvenirs or something else, but then I'm going to apply it to pop culture stuff or some other references. And that's something that there's a company called Midnight Society. I've shown you their patches and stuff before that they do very well. They do these classic like collector patches that look like resort stuff or that look like national park patches, and then they apply them to fake places from pop cultures. They've taken their inspiration from one place, their subject from another place, and then they have continually made that into a new thing, and they mashed it up. Right now, I say sleep on it. I think you should take in all of these inspirational elements. Don't try and knock them off immediately. Don't stare at them. Take them in, think about them, then sleep on it. Come back and say, all right, we've spent a little time and let that cook on that back burner mentally. Now we take those inspirations and put them together in this new format. And what can we do? And the best thing is if we take a little bit from here, a little bit from there, more than two sources, and then we can kind of not be doing knockoffs, right? Knockoffs are not what I'm into. I am into, however, seeing what's out there and taking inspiration. Inspiration is fine. So retail research, perfectly fine. Go out there and see what's out there, especially if you're someone working in the commercial world. And even if you're working in the craft or maybe I would say the boutique embroidery world, there's a really good chance that if something gets popular in retail, you'll be asked for it here soon. If it's popular in retail now, it's popular in fashion now, it's going to be in the common kind of consciousness. Somebody will vibe with that, see it out there. And because honestly, most of our clients are not creating things themselves, they are going to be looking at existing things that are out there in the world, getting inspired, and they don't know about it until they see it. How are they going to see it? Well, they're going to see it in the major channels by which we see any embroidery, which is going to be retail or fashion or somewhere out in the in the world, out in the box stores, out in the high stores, in the department stores, in the fashion world, depending on what level and what engagement they have with that kind of work. They're going to see apparel decoration out in the world, so we might as well know what that apparel decoration looks like and then be able to take some inspirations from it. However, the concept we're actually going to talk about here is seeing in stitches and understanding what those stitches look like, what they do, and really working on how we would ourselves kind of interpret those and work with those, right? Trying to make our own versions of things. And I'm actually going to tell you where the original concept came from to work on this. Now, first, I have this up on our thumbnail. So in the thumbnail, you can already see there's a hat in the center of the patch hat, and we're looking at a zoomed in image of an ape here. And I'll actually show you that in a little more detail. But this came in from somebody who was watching one of the other shows that I was a guest on or a host on, and said, "Hey, have you seen these patches from this particular company?" And I'll go ahead and bring it up because I'm very clear about who I'm looking at and who I'm discussing. In this case, this is a company that I'm going to say Gorin Brothers. I may be pronouncing it incorrectly, and because I'm not aware of them on a larger scale, I will just admit that ahead of time. It's entirely possible I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but Gorin Brothers that does these trucker hats that have become fairly popular. I mean, they're a hat company that has a storied history, so they've been around for quite some time, right? A couple hundred years of Gorin Brothers. But I've seen a couple different people asking about these patches. Now, I'm going to say something that might sound a little bit dismissive, and I don't mean it to sound dismissive, but I'm just going to say it anyway because it's kind of how I felt. When I first looked at some of these patches and some of these hats, honestly, looking at the digitizing, it's not that it is bad or anything, but I didn't see it as like, wow, this is digitizing I can't imagine anybody doing. And that should be kind of cheering to you as well, because I'm looking at the pieces going, yeah, they're interesting, they're cool, but this is not what I would consider a sublime level of digitizing that no one can attain, right? This is not crazy. What it is naturalistic digitizing. But what I would say is most of the really great stock design digitizers that digitize animals, I think could attain these finishes, right? I'm not saying I'm not the best, and I'm going to tell on myself by showing some of my animals as we talk about this analysis, because I am not an animal guy. I do not do animal digitizing the best, but these are some of the pieces I was looking at. And when I'm looking at these, I'm saying, all right, I can see immediately. And like we said, we're talking about seeing in stitches, right? So remember, we are talking about seeing stitches. Certainly when I look at one of these pieces immediately, some of the stuff I'm seeing is that I've got some texture here. If I bring my cursor in, and I should go ahead and turn on pointer focus for you so you can see it a little bit better. But if I turn on pointer focus and you can see my cursor a little better, maybe we can figure that out. That right in here, there's some shadow and some light spots. I've got some deeper, tight scans that we'll look at later. But immediately upon looking at this piece, I see that in this area of the neck, um, though those are some fill stitches very likely, or it looks to me like there's some filling stitches, that the texture is a little erratic. It's a little rough. I don't see smooth lines. I see roughness, and I'm seeing some ripples in this texture in the neck. So looking at this immediately, I'm going to tell you, all right, well, I've got maybe some fill stitches. There might be some fill in there, but in that fill, especially in the black on this panther, the likelihood is that there is some texture that's irregular, that's at the very least random stitch length, if not a custom texture, very likely. Plus, we're seeing some things like shading that look very manual to me. Why do they look manual? Well, because these stitch angles change dramatically from stitch to stitch, because there's only a couple stitches in any given place. So they'd probably be either a manual stitch or a straight stitch. And because you can throw a straight stitch, you can click on our nodes smaller than one stitch length, you can end up using a straight stitch and get a very manual like look, because as long as you're under the length of a stitch, it's of course going to go the entire distance between the 2 points. So you can have those shorter lengths, and unless you do a really long stitch length, you won't see that it's a regular length of stitches, because straight stitches generally are going to be a long span of regular stitch penetration. So when I look at this, that's the kind of stuff I'm saying. Or I'll say I can look at these whiskers, and they do look like regular stitch penetrations because the shadows in those between those stitches look pretty regular. They're coming at regular intervals. Stitch length is regular, though it looks pretty short, which gives us kind of a dotted look. Like I said, it's not that these are bad pieces; they're good pieces. They look very nice. But what I kind of said originally when people started asking me about these pieces is like, I think most digitizers who do animals would be able to handle these, right? Now, certainly there's some things we could look at. Once again, if we're talking about stitch types, well, we're going to say we're trying to see the stitches here. These may be manually placed. We have the shading that's in this goat's neck. However, it can also be a loose density zigzag in layers. What we do see, however, is this pattern. These curved lines, these overlapping lines where there's a little bit of density and then it gets lighter and then density, that indicates that we probably have overlapping strips of maybe a loose satin stitch being done in the shading, or it could be manually set zigzag, or it could be zigzag itself. The other thing we can look at is the edges look a little uneven. Either we're probably using something like feathering or jaggedness on the edge, or we're manually setting stitches and we're just literally placing those points in that way. So, like I said, this is where this kind of started, was looking at some of this Gorin Brothers stuff, but I am going to go into more detail. And like I said, we've got some bigger pieces to look at and some other pieces that I have from an original episode I did about seeing in stitches, and some other pieces. Like I said, I'm going to tell them myself. I've got some of my animals here. I've got pieces you may have seen before, like the jumping mouse from the Boscadil Apache hats that I show pretty frequently. There's an older piece of mine where I did a quail head for a company that raised blue scale quails. But let's go ahead and grab this hat again, right? This is the Boss hat. This is from Gorin Brothers again. I can get this to zoom correctly, it's acting up a little bit. If we can get it to zoom correctly, we'll try and take a look at that deeper. If not, we may have to do something else. I may have to bring up the thumbnail again. But let me go ahead and pop back out and see if I can get that to work. For some reason we're having some issues with the browser popping up images, but we'll go ahead and check that out real quick. But yeah, like I said, it's something that we can look at. We can look at the different types of stitches that are there. But the first thing I want to make clear to you guys is that it's not always about stitch types, and stitch types may not really be what we're looking at. We're actually looking at individual stitches, and as we know, I've always complained that there is no stitch type so much as um, every stitch is made out of a single kind of stitch. We only have one stitch. When we're talking about an interlock embroidery machine, which is what we essentially have, is a glorified sewing machine. It can only make one line from point to point, and that's all it can create, really. It can't make anything more than that. It can make that individual stitch point to point, one line of a single thickness, because that's the thickness of thread, unless we're using multiple thicknesses of thread. So anything we really make is made out of one single stitch collected in different ways. We can talk about the tools. I talked about satin stitches because we saw those strips of overlapping satin or overlapping zigzag. We can look at the hints and say we could make that with that tool, but you could just as easily be making that with a manual zigzag. Plus, depending on your software, you could have a column that was called a satin column or a zigzag column, and you could make that in multiple ways and still end up with the same stitch patterns. So ultimately, what I want to make clear is that when we use stitch types, I like to put scare quotes on them, because stitch types are really a way that we enter and generate these things, but it's not necessarily an actual stitch type. And now I do have my images back, but I'm going to grab some comments before I jump those back in real quick. So like I said, it's just something we're going to talk about here in general. But yeah, it's one of those things where I have to make it clear that anything we have, we can produce manually. It's about time. And when we're talking about things like this, when we have naturalistic representation of animals, you should assume that at some point in the shading, at some point in the outlining, there's probably going to be a fair amount of drawn straight stitch or manual stitch, because animals often with fur patterns, with whiskers, with small details, with naturalistic areas where you might want to change your angle of your stitches quite drastically or go from very short stitches to very long stitches, it's pretty common to go back and lean on that manual stitch to create elements like that, or to feed small amounts of like ticking or shading into an existing piece of embroidery. And it's what I always call working into the existing stitching. You often have an area where you may have filled in a color, but you want like in that fill, it's all landing on the angle, but we want some of our shading to sink in. So we might have a second color and draw in our shading very carefully so that it lays into the angle of the existing shading. You can do that by layering multiple layers of things like fills in general, or other kinds of satins together, and you can create some shading like that that does lay together or act more like silk shading. But it's really common to see manual stitching, and it's really common to see randomness added to things that are naturalistic like this. So though we're talking about seeing stitches in general, part of it really is born out of looking at these Gorin Brothers hats. And on these hats, they have a lot of that kind of manual stitching, manual shading, and roughness or texture, right? So it really depends on what you're looking at, how you're trying to make that work, certainly. But you can always lean back on, and I think almost all animal work in one way or another is going to have manual adjustment or manual stitches involved in it. And often the problem people have is that they're looking for a stitch tool that creates a fill or a texture, and it's not a tool. It's often not a tool that's making it. There's not a shading tool that's making fur in that way. It's more that people are adding to or layering multiple things together in order to achieve that final naturalistic look. And very often, either the shading or some highlights are going to end up being done manually. Also, it's thinking about layering. That's one of the things I actually show in the mouse that is a thing I've referred to way too many times. Sometimes there are things like you want to have a little bit of like dotted or ticked fur colors. I have a light ivory color that I wanted to come out of that fur on that mouse, and I allowed it to show through later layers. So you can't really see connecting stitches, because what I did was I actually used something very much like a zigzag in an area, but then a fill on top of it. The zigzag showed through only when there were gaps in the fill on top. And so you didn't see connecting stitches, but you saw little dots of ivory thread coming forward. So you do have to think about things like layering, but it is still a fairly manual process where we have to think about layers, we have to think about how things are put together, and where texture is actually quite a big part of it. And I think animal designs are very particular. Joanne says, and I agree with this, I can only think of seeing a handful of great animal designs in all my years of embroidery, tough to replicate by an average digitizer. Yes, I will agree with that. Really great, really fantastic animal designs are hard to do. What I would say, though, is looking at the Gorham Brothers pieces, they are on what I would consider a level with most stock animal designs. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's the style they're going for, frankly. It's on a trucker. It's referring to that classic look of a patch trucker hat, which definitely leans back into the vintage. It leans back into manually punched designs from the 70s when the height of that seed corn trucker hat style was going on. It leans into the vintage stuff I showed in previous classes and previous episodes where I talk about like the old school Voyager patches, the collectible badges, and there's a lot of that manual stitching that has multiple directions, that has shading. But I would say it's not, however, like some of the animals I've seen done. Like, guys, I always tell you that I used to hire out all of my breed dogs and cats and pet portraits to someone who did beautiful, immaculate fur work. Her work looked photographic in the way that the fur was laid. I don't think the Gorham Brothers stuff does. That doesn't make it bad. And in fact, I think it's attractive work, but the work I think looks more like retro pieces. I think that's what it looks like to me. It looks more like retro pieces. They look good. They look solidly good. But what I think is even some of that stuff, you can get an approximation or something that's really close. You can get to that level. And I don't think it's something where it's necessarily, not all of it was individually placed stitches. Now, there's some of it that was. And I'm actually going to show the piece that I was trying to bring up earlier, now that I've got that back up, that has what I would consider quite a bit of individually placed stitching and would take practice for a digitizer to achieve for sure. But what I'm going to say is that not all of them were like that. And when we break it down, we can still get cues and we can work on things like I often show, where you don't have to go to the level of that individual individual hairs in fur to make that thing look pretty good. So I think that's one of the things we're going to talk about. So we'll go there. We'll go there. Anyway, suffice to say, we got a couple more things to say. But yeah, Ramona says, I love the mouse. We'll bring the mouse. The mouse is coming back because I have to use it. It's a good teaching tool. It's not my only animal design, but it's a good teaching tool. Joanne says, would you say that animal designs are generally higher on the density side? Seems like the substrate stability would be important for direct animal embroidery. I think they often end up being denser, but it's not by necessity. It's because when people are laying multiple colors of fur, like I said, together, we're trying to get these layers of shading, and we're getting light highlights and shading, and we're trying to maybe do some outlining in the midst of all that. That people have a tendency to go too hard. They end up where they've got almost full coverage in the background, and then they start shading on top of it. Whereas it probably makes more sense to put down some light coverage and work into it, and then do your first stitch out and say, how close am I to full coverage? And then honestly, on animals, depending on the substrate you're going on, full coverage might not be the thing. However, when we're working on patches like this, we're working on 12 patches that are very obviously edged after the fact. I think you can go fairly dense, and it's probably okay. Though, as I always say, though fine grain material is nice to hold up to a lot of stuff, fine grain, tough materials also means that they're pretty dense. And when we try and drive too many needle points in the same areas, we can end up with that three-dimensional density that causes the rippling and puckering. If we're continually like pressing it flat as we do making patches, might be fine, and probably fine for emblems. I wouldn't necessarily do super heavy animal work anywhere else. Plus, I'm going to say this, like I said, and I was like I said, pretty good pieces over here at Gorham Brothers. They're not bad pieces at all. If I bring up this goat piece that I saw earlier, I'm actually seeing some nice light densities. I'm not hating these densities at all. When I look at this piece, it looks to me like, classic trucker has a patch done that's added post. But when we look at it, we've got a lot of open zigzags. We have a lot of light material. Plus, we're using the background color of the patch really nicely. Not all the pieces are like that. Absolutely. Some of them are full coverage on light backgrounds. Most of them are. Or we have this full coverage. We have this wolf that's light on a dark background. Very obviously, we're going to have some coverage that's involved in that piece, right? We're going to have a fair amount of coverage. But even if we look at the coverage that's in this wolf, I would argue that we've got some show through. They've lightened it up just a little bit. It's not super, super crazy heavy. not too bad, right? These are not super warped pieces. If we look at them from the off angle, we're not seeing a lot of warping in the actual field. Uh, yes, animal designs I think tend to end up being a little heavy. I think not by necessity. It's more that people uh, maybe a little accidentally, because they're really interested in making things look realistic, then they end up with some, kind of extra density. And some of these pieces really are quite fine. This is a very fine piece. This lion piece is where we've got much more of that fine detail and texturing. But even then, I'm going to say that it's not super, super heavy, and I'm seeing a little bit of that color through. So it is kind of hard. It's kind of hard. Well, let's go ahead and back this up. So we've looked at this lion. That's fine. I'm going to bring up this particular piece because it's one that we've got some really good scans on. So this is the boss hat from them that is featuring a gorilla, and it's got some really interesting coloring and shading patterns. And I'm just going to bring that up so we can kind of discuss a little bit about looking at these stitches, right? So let's bring up the actual piece at full size. And luckily, we have a very nice high resolution photo of this piece, right? Really nice high resolution photo. We can actually get quite a lot out of this piece and get some good detailed looks. Now, honestly, the first thing I'm going to say on this, you can tell that when we're looking at this piece, we do not have incredibly high coverage everywhere. We've got a little bit of show through, but we can also say we're not seeing a lot of super, super regular unidirectional fill, right? I would argue that over here in the arm, certainly we've got some fill stitch that's in here that has then been shaded back into manually. I would say we've got some lightness in here. We've got some shading that's done manually on top of some fill type stitches, but we're seeing a lot of shading on top of this piece. We're seeing a lot of shading in general in this area. And Springer is asking me, is it stitched on vinyl? I don't know. I'm going to be honest with you and say I don't know. I'd say looking at it really tightly, when we're looking at this piece, the way that these penetrations look, I think this probably is a vinyl patch. Yes, it's something like that. Because of the way the penetrations look, they look stretched. They don't look like it doesn't look like a woven material. I think this is probably stitched on something that has some sort of coated substrate or vinyl. It could also be a coated fabric. I don't know. But what I will say about it is, when we're talking about stitch types, if you can see just how random some of these look, we have these directions that move back and forth. Though there's certainly some regular zigzags, which tell me that there's a possibility of using tools that might be producing zigzag columns. We can see kind of this radial pattern. I am going to wager that a good portion of this is done with at least some manual stitching. So we have some zigzags, we have some manual stitching, and certainly when we get into this shading, we can see how connected back and forth. Yes, there are some places where it drops together, but it looks to me like we're changing direction frequently. This dark gray shading in here is very likely to be manual or straight stitch, and I'm going to argue that it's probably someone using a straight stitch like a manual, because where we have some things that have longer stitches, stitch penetration points are lining up, but most of the stitches are so short that they're more like a manual drop, where we are clicking at every little corner. We are clicking back and forth, zigzagging through and going back and forth, and just planning our run fairly carefully. And I'm saying the same thing here, very small manual stitches in the bridge of the nose, but we are seeing some satins in the nose. We are seeing what I would say certainly some satins out here in this gray on the edge. But when we're talking about this shading here, this is overlapped, very loose zigzag on top of what may or may not be some satin shading below it. But when I'm seeing the amount of show through, I'm feeling like that is either loose zigzags laid on top of each other or satins. The thing is, you can't necessarily tell what tool was used just by looking at the stitch. You're not going to know the tool necessarily just by looking at the stitch. We can see certain things that are likely, right? If I'm looking at a very regular pattern of filling, this gray in here really looks to me like it is a tatami style standard filling stitch. The patterns are regular, they're fairly smooth. Yes, there's some shading that's done either below or on top of it. Looks to me like it was on top of it in the same angle as the fill, but there's some filling going on that's pretty regular. And I would say if we look into the chest here, there's probably some fairly regular filling that might have a randomized stitch length in it. But what we're looking at is essentially one angle. If we see me kind of drawing that angle, that's our primary stitch angle. We have that kind of stitch angle going on over here as well. That's our same primary stitch angle in the arm. Could have some curvature to it, but it is a fairly regular fill. And up here on the top of the head, we can see a satin stitch that is turning. We have a satin style stitch that's turning, and that gray is underneath all of the shading. We can see other shading coming up on top of it. We can see that this darker gray shading is on top of it because it's all connected, and we can visualize all the connectors. It's not being hidden or showing through. So we can see our layering, and we can see the kind of stitches that are done. But the thing is, ultimately, any of this could have been made manually if they wanted to, and it could be made with other stitch types. So the thing to look for are kind of these hallmarks of what kind of stitch types they might use, certainly, but it's also just looking at the quality of the stitches themselves and saying to yourself, well, how could I produce that? If I wanted these overarching kind of rounded layers of stitches that go together that have these zigzag angles, what are my options to make those happen? And we can look at what's laying on top, and I can say that we've got multiple layers of color laying on top of each other where we're building up in different areas. Now in this one is so randomized that I'd probably stare at it a while trying to figure out which one was on top, and I'd be looking for occlusion, like saying, all right, if I've got some stitches here in the gray and it looks very much like these stitches in the lighter kind of tan are going on top of them and holding them down, then I can start to build up the layers and say that the gray was laid down before the lighter brown. And then we have a darker kind of medium brown that's being used on top of that for part of the shading, this kind of rusty color that we got in here. But whenever we look at these other elements, we can kind of do that same thing where when you see an exposed edge like this, that looks like it's sitting on top of something else, but this is probably run later than the piece that it's under because we have this highlight that's running along the top. But it is much harder with animals, right? It is much harder with animals and naturalistic randomized pieces. Those kinds of naturalistic randomized stitches are just going to be harder for us to tell, and a lot of it may or may not be manual. The thing is, that I definitely want to tell people is not happening is someone is not saying, okay, fill this with one stitch type in 3 colors and it's a big block. No one is drawing the outside edge of this shape and then clicking and saying stitch type. When I'm looking at this piece, there may be some things that are done with some turning satins. There may be some things that you could do with turning fills in that space. But I think that if you look at the totality of it, if you look at especially how often that we're changing directions of stitches, uh, in the block, it's not likely at all to have these blocks together in the same color be one block of stitching. It's layers upon layers of stitching that's put together. Now we can look at some stuff that's not quite that detailed and still get some concepts on that, right? Certainly we're looking at all these other pieces and there are elements that we can kind of call out and say, yeah, we've got different stitch types. Let's look at something much more graphical, right? This is a piece of mine. It's a really fairly simple piece that's done for a volleyball team that was doing what we call a mud volleyball tournament. They're literally playing in big mud pits, but we're doing the same thing when we're breaking this very simple piece up, right? We're looking at the same kind of elements and the same kind of styles. And I'm just going to kind of bring some of this stuff up and say, yeah, we're stitch types. Certainly, we can talk about stitch types, but what can we really tell about any stitches that we're looking at, right? We can look at the length of stitches. Are they longer or shorter? Is the length random within the block? Is it randomized like we do have, say, a filling stitch? Does it look regular? So what we're really looking for is not just stitch length. We're looking for regularity. We're looking for pattern. So, but really, when we're looking at 8 stitches, what we have is the length of the stitch, of the individual stitch, and the overall length in a block, and how regular it is. We're looking for the angle of the stitch, so we can look at the individual angles and how they change. So it's still regularity, because if you have one stitch angle that goes into a different angle randomly or very quickly, then we know we have something being done to make that happen. Either we are using something manual, or maybe there can be things like a hand stitch effect being applied that changes angles more randomly, but that's something we can also see. We are looking at spacing. Now, I have density listed here because in a block of single colored stitching that we're filling an area, that's density. But when we're looking at things like details that are sketched in, that might be considered spacing to some people because it's not a setting. We are drawing individual lines. And if we're drawing individual lines, we are spacing them. And like I said, overall, we're looking at regularity. That's part of it. Regularity is what gives us types. What is a stitch type? It's a block where we define the whole block and then it's programmatically filled according to a set of variables. That's a stitch type, right? So when we look at this particular piece, which is much simpler, we've got a few things we can certainly look at. First thing to recognize is this entire big brown area. Obviously, the filled in area behind it is not one single block. Because we change from one type of texture to another, because we have clear demarcations where there are shadows and highlights, we know that these multiple blocks are drawn separately and they are filled with different stitch types by software. And if we're looking at this piece, we can immediately say, all right, there's a fairly clear line of demarcation between what looks like a fill type stitch here and these satin like stitches. We also see that in between each of these kind of these individual droplets. We actually have these strokes in here that look to be individual pieces. Either it could be one piece with a split, but because I don't see any show through between them, I'm going to consider these are probably overlapped satin-like columns. And we have this column here that's separate. So when we're looking at the piece, we're going to say, all right, what's our kind of stitch types? Well, we have these satin-like types here. We have satin types here that look to be overlapped. Then we have this is a filling stitch type. But if we look at stitch lengths, well, these are satin length. They are entirely the length of the entire column. So they're a normal satin or a null satin type fill. But we look in this piece and we're like, yeah, it looks like a filling stitch. It's fairly regular, but it's got some randomization. So when we look at the regularity on this piece, we say, all right, it's not so irregular that it has to be done manually, but it is irregular enough that we have to set some randomization in our stitch types or in our stitch settings for a fill in order to make it happen. Other thing we can look at is angle. And in this particular piece, we go, all right, this has a very distinct curve. Likelihood is because it is fairly regular stitching that fills an area that has a curve. This is a curved fill with a randomized stitch length. And it is. I'm having created it. Yes, it is. That's what that is. So obviously what happened was, though we were given this big block of color, Digitizer, which was me in this case, broke it up into multiple pieces. We have one piece for this fill. We have a satin column that handles this. We have this column here, this column here, this column here. So we actually have a grand total of 5 objects and 6 if you count the outline that make up this little splash of mud. If we look at the ball behind here, we can also kind of get the same concepts, right? We're looking at angles, stitch types, spacing, density, everything else. And what we have is very obviously a turning satin-like input because these are columns. Each of these is an individual column. The stitch angle changes depending on which panels are on the ball. But we also see that there are penetration points within each of these pieces that are slightly randomized. So this is either an auto split or a length limited satin stitch split. Not a fill because the penetration points don't go evenly all the way to the edge. It is much more likely to be a satin-like stitch, a column stitch that has some sort of edge padding, and then has splits in the middle that are regular but uneven. They're regular but stepped. We don't have a nice carved groove down the middle, so it's not a traditional split satin. So when we're seeing stitches, we're looking at the stitch types, but what we're really seeing is like what's the length, what's the angle, what's the spacing, and then how regular is it, and what's the pattern. Through observation, what are the tools that I could use to recreate these pieces? And it's like I said, it is much harder. It is much more complicated once we get to animal pieces. And that's even pieces that are simpler than what we saw in the ape, right? In the ape piece, in this boss hat, we have some really quite intricate patterns. Now, at the same time, if we break them down, you can see, all right, we have these layers of fill-like stitch. They're fairly open. We have these individual lines of stitching that are connected, that are fairly obviously a shading that's done after the fact. And we can see that as we go into these different layers of shading, that we follow these stitch angles. If we are careful at how we observe, we can start to see how it's put together, even though it's complicated, and realize that if we build it up a color at a time, we build it up a layer at a time, that we end up with something like this, and we can start to play with the concept that gets us there. Admittedly, there are just some of those things that have to be, as we're working through here, that have to be just thought of in that way, right? Now I'll go ahead and go back to. It looks like some people were saying they cannot see the mouse. I'll go ahead and pull up the mud volleyball piece one more time, and just break that up for you again. But here's once again, we'll zoom in on it. We can see this curvature here. That's our fill block. It ends here. We can see because we've got these satins. If we look closer to it, we can also see that because we don't see the sharp end of the satins, that these satins were probably completed before the mud, or they line up right up against that mud in such a way that it's not visible. That's a little harder to tell. In this case, the fill area is on top. We can see that curve. It's pretty obvious to see the curve of the stitch line, so it's a curved fill. The randomization, the penetration points, the shadows are uneven. They're irregular, so it's definitely a randomized fill. And like I said, in here, we see that these stitch angles are varying from panel to panel. So we've got columns that have this fairly randomized split inside. It's not so total random stitch length, but it's offset. So it's not just a split set and then split right down the center. It's something like an auto split or a length limit. We can tell all these things, right? And I'm actually going to go ahead and tell on myself. Like I said, I bring my own examples up. Blue scale quail is one of my older pieces. Unfortunately, the photo of it's not awesome, but I can bring up the file as well. What we can tell is we've got the patterns in here. They look fairly regular, but when we look up into uh, the crest here and we look into the cheek, we can see just from the patterns of these shadows that line up a little bit, the chances are that this was done not with manual stitches, but with a straight stitch tool to create that shading. But in those straight stitches, they were done manually. It's not a fill, it's not a fill block. They were dropped in manually. You can also see how things are radially going away from the face. Though that you could say, all right, is that a curved fill? There's too much randomness in it and in the layering for it to be a curved fill. You also see these little lines of shading that are in this backdrop. We'll see some gray lines of shading here. And these outlines in the black edges of the scale, that is fairly obviously a very regular straight stitch, but we can see that there's shading that's laid on manually. The great thing is I can pull up the file for this, though I'm going to pull up not the original file. I'm actually going to pull up a different file than that. I'm going to pull up the stitch file so that I don't have the blocks. I don't want you to see necessarily the blocks that I drew, but we will look at the actual piece and kind of just run through it and see kind of how it's built. It's an early animal piece of mine, one of my first birds that I did, but it's something that I think is interesting to look at, right? How was that piece built? That's fairly naturalistic. So we'll remind ourselves of what it looks like here. So that's our quail. That's what it looks like fully stitched out. Unfortunately, I don't have a great picture of this one. I probably need to run that one again. And this is what we're going to look at in the software, right? So in software, when we look at this closer, we can see how it's built. So we were right about some of that curvature being curved fill. Here we can see it's very even. Certainly, we couldn't see this if we were looking at it ourselves. We're looking at the final piece, but now that we're looking at here, it's very obvious to us in the file that it's curved fill. What was less obvious is that we actually have a curved fill being used for most of the base blue color in the neck. What made it look less obvious as a curved fill? Certainly outlines that were there made it look less obvious, but as you can see, we've got we have a manual darker blue thread being used here to do shading. So this manual shading on some of these pieces, because it is very manual, we've got zigzags here. We have something that looks like a fill stitch here because it's dropped in a fill stitch like pattern, but it's not. It's dropped manually as one big piece. That manual stitch breaks up that texture. Also, if we turn on our penetration points, we can see that even in the curved fill that's down here, yes, it is fairly regular, but when we add the penetration points from the textural kind of shading on top of it, it breaks up that outline and makes it look a little bit more natural. So not everything has to be manual just because it looks rough. Same thing here. If we look at the penetration points in this fill of the neck, you can see that though they are fairly regular, they're offset, they're scattered a little bit. They have a small amount of randomness in the fill setting. So when we're looking at it, yes, it's fairly naturalistic, but there's some randomness in the fill setting that is not necessarily manual stitching. However, as we get into things like these areas where we have margins, borders between colors on animals, one of the ways we can make things look better is to go in, even if we're using fill-like stitches in other areas, and use manual type stitching as we see here in this kind of fringe along this color break in order to notate these kind of hairs or the little pieces of the feather areas that are going to be looser that don't look so mechanical. But you can still see I am using a fill type stitch for some of this other blue shading. But as we have this darker shading that has to rotate around the head, though it looks like a fill, it actually isn't a fill. We can see that it changes direction to calmly, and it actually goes in and has large gaps inside of the same piece. We could have created some of that with randomized curved fills, but this piece was actually done manually, and we can see that by that very quick change of angle and stitch length. So we do still have a fill for this kind of ear spot that's here, but as we see, what we're using is we're layering fills. So here's our curved fill for the top of the head, and then using randomized stitching at the borders, so at the areas where colors come together, and in the shading to enhance the look of it being manual. What's also funny about this, that crest in the front, once again, looks very much like a fill, and it has a fill stitch like underlay that's providing color coverage, but this was all dropped manually, and you can tell because of the stitch penetration points being so rough. As we see here, I'll drop penetration points out. We can see that though they are regular in that they are on each individual strand, we can see a shadow, 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 very regular in length. They were dropped individually, and the density is not entirely regular. This was drawn in manually. And because we have things like these really fine tips that it goes out to at the edges, those really fine tips are drawn with a straight stitch. Whereas some of these other pieces that are here are actually done with a contour tool. So if you guys have seen like my FDNY fire piece where I have those long contour satins and where it's like it looks like it's a column stitch, but it has stitches that travel along that contour. These feathers in the back were done with a contour tool and essentially drawn vertically, as well as these blue feathers here. They look more manual, but they were actually done with a contour tool. So there is a column here with a contour. Thing is, if you did them manually, they would look similar because the way a contour tool works inside of a column is to draw inside of those boundaries along the length of the column that you draw out. As you draw that shape, it stitches the individual straight stitch courses until we reach that target kind of density, the number of lines that's available in the column. So you can see by combining manual stitches at the kind of these barrier points, as these border points, and using fills for color coverage, we still get a fairly naturalistic texture. Like I said, it's maybe not the best piece ever, but there we are. It has that fairly naturalistic texture that we were looking for. And we can see that kind of reflected in the way it's put together here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and give you guys a slow replay on this thing so you can kind of see it come together. Here's our Zia sign. There's the initial fill. We can see there is a curved fill, a little bit of randomness, but in the case of feathers like these, they were pretty smooth. I didn't want the randomness to be high. It's not supposed to look like fur. The feathers are pretty smooth. They're smooth, glossy. Good to have regular patterns here. We've got some of that white that is, as you can see, also loose density, less density than full coverage. Why? Because I know I'm going to come back in and layer in color on top of it. So loose density on the white that's going underneath the eye area. And then we see the contours being drawn for the top feathers at the top of the crest. We go back in, gray, there's a much more complete density because it's going to be completely filled. It's going up on top of the blue. Then we have the darker gray stitching that is manually placed with straight stitch. Travel back up and we go through and manually draw that shading again. But once we get to the ear spot where it's going to be a full coverage and very regular, very smooth, that's a fill, curved fill. Back into the blue and we are drawing that shading. And as you can see, just straight stitch manually placed. That one's got an error in the jump. I can see a jump there that's not supposed to be there. I grabbed an older version of it. But the top of the head is an absolutely a real normal block of fill. And you can see how it's drawing that edge run first. This is a standard block of fill. I could actually probably reduce that, the border looking so rough by taking out that edge run. That's something I probably should have done. Once again, early piece of mine. I'm learning as long as you are. Here are some more of those contour feathers. So those are done with a contour column. Then we have, this is once again the manual blue shading that goes on top of the white that was under the eye. So it blends into the white and then it comes in and starts to add that lighter blue. Then this contour was put in manually, but first there was a manual underlay laid in so that that dark contour feather had some coverage for color underneath it. After that, we're into the outlining. You can see the outlining is done very manually. This manual straight stitch work. We're drawing lines and making sure we go over them twice. Then we have the beak, which is made out of satins. And then here's the final kind of outlining that's done. Once again, straight stitch, very regular. So regular penetration points, regular stitch lengths, and drawn in passes. Satin stitch for the eye. And then pièce de resistance right on this piece. As we finish up the piece, we have my favorite thing to do for an eye shine on an animal, little tiny star. I will zoom in on that. You want to make a little tiny dot on the eye. Five-pointed stars make awesome little tiny dots. They also tie themselves off when you trim. So little tiny five-pointed star becomes a dot in the final piece that looks round. So that's, like I said, naturalistic pieces. There, you can achieve them without drawing every single line of fur. Really, what you're looking for is to break up the regularity. So when we're looking to analyze this stuff, though we can say, all right, this looks like we've got this tremendous amount of manual work into it. Yes, you can put a tremendous amount of manual work, but even in this piece, we can see, like I said, in that shoulder, that we have a fill stitch that we're working into, that there is a regular satin border on this edge that we then work back into with manual edges, with manual shading. And in fact, I could totally see somebody going in on a piece like this, filling in a base tan color in behind this piece, and then just drawing loose shading stitches on top so that the coverage doesn't have to come from the fur pattern. I guess that's kind of the real crux of this. The coverage doesn't have to come from the fur pattern, but when we're analyzing stitches in general, we're just looking for the same things, even if we're looking for something simple. We look at this piece here. What's interesting about this piece? This is a very graphical, not natural wing that's on an eagle, but we can see a few things that are interesting to pick out. What makes it a little more organic? Penetration points are very obviously randomized in some fashion, and each of the feathers has an angle that sweeps into the specific feather, or it's a panel where we have a general curved fill that sweeps. In this case, some of them are individual, some of them are done in other ways, but our stitch angle follows the angle of the feather. It continues on that angle. We also have that very auto split satin type up here, or length limit satin on the top. We have length limit satins being used on these kind of border fringes and turning satins in the edges. These are the same kind of things to look for. What are we looking for? Stitch length, texture, pattern, regularity, density. These are the things we're going to look for no matter what we're working on, whether it's naturalistic or not. And I mean, you guys have seen me talk about this many times before with analyzing designs, but even when we're looking at things that are finished embroideries, we can still see a lot in them. And I talked about this in an earlier episode, so I've got some stuff here. Got some retail research pieces too. We look at these pieces and we can see the same thing where we've got some regular columns. Though this has a rough edge in this butterfly piece, this is very likely a satin column that was drawn as a column. The randomness on this piece very likely comes from some jaggedness that was set in a setting. It's either jaggedness or feathering at the edge. These are individual columns of satin stitch that are very easy to see. The rings out here, also satin stitch columns, very easy to see. When we get up into the shading on this piece though, once again, what do we see? Stitch length is very regular. These are the same length out and back. What this is, these are straight stitches. Straight stitches run in for the color shading on top. We can tell that the orange is on top of the red because the red is being occluded, being blocked by the orange. So we drew these red lines in, we drew the orange lines in coming back down the other side. But if we look carefully, there is a light color in a light density that's done as a fill where the angle does not change. This angle up here rotates it's very slight turning angle maybe, but it looks to me like the same light color angle is underneath this piece, and this piece, and it's below both the red and the orange. So if we look very carefully, we can say, all right, I can kind of tell the spacing on this. I can look at how far apart these are. I can see that the other ones are thicker, and we see that each one of these stitches is made up of multiple passes because it looks to me like we have maybe four or five runs per stitch in this case. So it looks like to me that this is a 5-pass bean stitch done in red, and then we come back and have either a 3 or 5-pass. It might be a 3-pass bean stitch in the orange, and these are done manually. The lines are just drawn manual on top. If we look at it from a distance, we can stop and go, okay, it just looks like it's random, it's rough, it's done entirely manually, but not really. We have straight stitch lines, so we're only clicking on each end of these lines here. We have a fill that's underneath them. We have two colors of that. Same thing up here. If we look at this piece up here, we've got a whip type stitch or a multi-count satin. How do we tell? Well, because we have one bar that looks like it's been gone over 3 to 5 times with a little skinny connector in between. So what is that doing? 1, 2, 3 on this piece, or maybe 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Back down with one connector and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we stare at the piece, we look at it under magnification, we take nice pictures, we can start to break it down. And these are just individual elements layered together to get something more rough, more naturalistic. Same thing in here. This, all the same angle, very regular spacing. Looks to me like we have two different colors here. Probably 2 layers of fill stitch with a randomized stitch pattern because it's not regular in here. So we would just turn up the random and 2 light layers of fill stitch that come together to make a full coverage or close to full coverage. And like I said, it's just kind of what we have to look for. We look at these different pieces, we analyze them in a deeper way, we look for regularity, we look for patterns, we look for roughness. I'll go ahead and break one more down and then we'll kind of get off of this train. Mostly, I just wanted to make it clear to folks that when we're looking at pieces, it's about the relationship between stitches more than the tools. And I'm going to show you a couple more examples real briefly, and then we'll do a brief discussion of the patch production real quick because I do have that one question somebody was asking me I want to cover. But this I think is fairly interesting and something that's worthwhile. If you see a piece that you want to replicate, what to look for. This is a piece of mine. Once again, Memento Mori piece that I did. And this Memento Mori piece, this skull is just a 2-color skull. We've got an ivory thread for the background. We have this dark brown thread for the rest of it. but we have some interesting textures to look at. So this is as far as we're zooming in on it. Without having a super high res look at it, we can still tell quite a lot, right? If we are looking at the skull, we've got this natural shadow that's occurring here that's not shaded. There's no other color thread. That must mean that this vault of the skull is on top of the back of the skull, but we can see that we've got a curve. Those shadows are following that curve. So here is a curved fill for the vault. We know for sure that's there. We see these patterns of shadow. You see how those patterns are a little bit rough and a little bit ribbed. Very likely we're using a randomized curved fill stitch in here. Same thing for the back of the head. But then when we look at the jawbone here, we can see, okay, I've got kind of these little ditches of some shadow, but our stitch angle continues to turn throughout the piece. It looks to me like, once again, auto split or a length limited satin stitch in here with some edge padding because we don't have penetration points close to the edge, so it's not a fill. Up here looks more like a fill. How can we tell? Even though there's a little bit of a padding here, we've got penetration points really close to the edge of that object. So that's a fill pattern, more likely. Whereas this piece has that nice big satin-like edge. That's a length limit with edge padding or an auto split satin. Also, because I don't have nice big carved lines down the middle, it's not a direct split satin because those would have shown right through. So we've got we've got the curve that's in the mid face. We have the different curve on the arch. Also, we can see that we've got a satin stitch brow ridge because it's unbroken stitches here that are in a really regular column with no weird edges on it. We can see the same thing happening in the bottom of this jaw, and we have some individual carving in the teeth. But if we look at the layering, jawbone is on top of this piece. The skull vault is on top of this back piece as well, but the brow ridge is probably going to run last. It's on top of everything else and has nice shadows. So that tells us a lot about how this stitch is put together. We need a satin here, split satin here, curved fill random here, curved fill random here. That's pretty easy to see if we start to really kind of analyze what we're looking at. We look at length, pattern, regularity. We look at spacing. It's all full coverage in this piece, and that's a stock design, so it was made for full coverage on most colors. Pretty dense. We know that we're probably going to be at normal densities, 0.4 thereabouts or 4 embroidery points for 40 weight thread. And if we look at the rest of the piece and the bones, a couple things we can tell on this is that we actually have them built out of individual satin stitches. Each one of the bones is built out of at least 3 satins. Got a small piece here with a satin. We've got another piece coming out a different turning direction, and then it looks like this piece is one continuous satin that goes throughout. So we can tell because of the stitch angles changing between here and here. And if we look at this edge here, we can actually see this little shadow that tells us that this satin stitch is on top of this one underneath it. So we can tell that the bones are built out of 3 satins. And then the other thing to notice is that all of the work that's done in the shading looks to be fairly continuous, drawn manually, but with a straight stitch, because where we have long sections of the straight stitch or running stitch, the stitch patterns are pretty regular. Aside from on curves where they shorten a little bit, they do end up matching kind of very regular lengths where they're not randomized. Looks to me like a lot of manual drawing, but manual drawing that was done with a straight stitch tool or a running stitch tool. Like I said, kind of the same thing. And I've shown you guys the mouse a million times. I was going to bring that back up. I will just pull it back up to show you. Same kind of action. We see these little checked white threads that are coming through. Those are run underneath. And this piece is actually built out of multiple fills. And I'll run you through it just to say, once again, this is one of those pieces where we're building with fills and then doing randomization on top of them or doing manual work on top of them. We have our satins for our legs. So they're carved out of multiple satins. We can see that from the shine and shadow. We have the ticking in the background. How can I tell this ticking is underneath everything? In the actual piece, the little tiny flecks of white aren't connected. So it's not something that was stitched on top. It's showing through the thread that comes later in the round. So we can tell that that ivory was put underneath it. So we have that ivory underneath there. We can see that the belly is a different angle, but it's a fill stitch. It's regular. We have those satins again. And as we see, a lot of this is built with fills. So, but as you can see again, manual stitches being used to break up the edge of a border. Remember that for making naturalistic stuff. So it's one of the things to look for. And as we go through here, we go through these fills. We have a curved fill here. So it's pretty standard fill, but if we look at our stitch penetration points on that fill, very obviously they are randomized. They're not regular. So they have the random setting put on. Also, we see how those edges are rough. That's feathering or jagged edge being set on that piece. So that's something to see. When we go through this piece, once again, another curved fill. And then I'm once again, shading is done manually, and we're breaking up the edges of fills by using shading. So jagged edge, and manual shading can help to break up the edges of fills. Plus, we work back into our fill to darken some areas with the same color with random angles so that the light shines off these little individual hairs that are present in that piece. We go to the next color. We're still in fill town right here, but then this shading is done manually in the middle. We have a nice light fill again. And once again, the shading gets manual once you see me getting into this position where I have to do some curving that's not going to work very well in any of the tools. But breaking up the edges, once again, breaking up the edges, the, the borders between colors is a frequent place to use manual detail to break those edges up. Then we have our outlining done after the fact, but as we can see, some of that shading and outlining is done, it's all done manually with straight stitch tools. And then this is the one kicker. When we get to the back here, I break up the entirety of the piece so that it doesn't look like these curved fills by doing this very randomized worm-like pattern of stitching where I'm making the fur look more random by just working into the piece. But in the back, you see all these little kind of vermicular kind of pathways that I've done. It breaks up the look of the fill, whereas on the tail end, I kept it looking in one direction because it's following the pattern of the actual fur. But you can see how much of this was fill. Look at how much of the actual coverage here is curved fill with a randomized stitch setting. But as we get to the end of it, of course, the details on top make the difference. Also, look at my edges. I'm letting some of those stitches, because this is a furry object, they're going loose, out past the edges of the border so that they are right out onto the fabric around the edge so that I don't have a nice hard clean edge, because the hard clean edge is what makes something look less natural. So you can see that I'm working those edges and having that go out. Now on the legs where they're smooth, we still have a nice hard edge. We have a nice hard outlined edge. Same thing with the tail. Though it has shading on it, it does have a nice hard outlined edge. But you can tell that I'm working to make this look fuzzier by allowing stitches to track off of that edge. And in the end, this looks pretty manual, but you just saw that a lot of it was done with curved fills with randomized settings, right? So I am going to go ahead, because somebody has asked, Carol says, I need to get in my Stitch Artist software and find randomized functions. Well, here's the thing. When we're talking about a fill block, this is something that I can do very quickly just to show you. I'll do it right in the middle of this piece because it's not something that's very hard to show. But if we are drawing in the fill block here, we actually can just provide you a small block of fill. And I'm going to go ahead and grab our fill stitch settings here. In this case, I think I'd like that color to be a little darker if I can, to give you something a little easier to see. Let's get some green here. So we'll zoom in on this piece, and then this is a piece of just standard fill stitch. We're going to zoom in on the selection so you can see it. Here we are in fill. This is going to be different in everybody's software, but in this particular software, we see this little setting down in the right-hand corner. It says RND. That stands for randomness. We're looking at the fill stitch. You see how regular that pattern is. Very regular, very smooth. If I go in here and I set the randomness on this piece to full 25%, you can start to see that now those patterns have changed. I now have something that looks much more naturalistic. I'll turn that pattern off. It's not nearly quite so regular as it was. And especially if I go in here and I've got a curved fill, if I start to use things like curves so that I can get a little bit of that texture changed, certainly the curve then fills that space a little differently, and we end up with a fill stitch pattern that is much less regular than we would have otherwise. The other thing I talked about as well when we're looking at these fills that is of some interest. Go ahead and cancel this out. We can talk about edge jaggedness as well. In this case, it's called feathering. And in this particular software, this is Stitch Artist, just to make it clear. There's other softwares that will have edge jaggedness listed instead of feathering. In this case, we click over here down in our fill patterns here. We can feather the different edges to different percentages. And you'll see that depending on how much, I'm doing it a little too much for comfort here. In fact, what I'm going to do also, let's drop out. We're going to drop out our underlays on this piece because we don't want those when we're doing shading. But in this actual piece, we can look at that feathering, and we can feather either side to a percentage. So that feathering is our jaggedness. And then we can set how much extension beyond the shape we want. And we can actually set a percentage of extension. So now we've got this piece where I started with a shape that is a square. The square is still there. Drew a square, but in the end, I've got a curvature to it. I've got randomization to the fill pattern, and I've got jaggedness on the sides. And we can see that I now have something that is much more naturalistic. And if I layer, multiple pieces together, and let's say now I go out and make this thing half density. Now I've got some half density pieces here. I can now layer these together in multiple colors, and I could use different curvature, different angles, and end up with something that looks much more like a naturalistic pattern. Or that in total, once I get them layered in together, we end up with kind of a more complete coverage as they layer piece to piece. So, like I said, just because you can see the type of stitch or the stitch quality of the piece, just because you can see the texture in the piece doesn't mean you necessarily know the tool that achieved it. And I'll actually give you one more example of that before I move on to my final points here today. Um, just to show you something fun, one of my very earliest designs I ever did was this piece right here. And this little E with a crown on it was something done before I had access to the real digitizing software all the time that I ran. I found a completely free digitizing software that allowed you to drop things in manually. I could do manual stitches, but here's the deal. If I show somebody this original piece, they're like, yeah, it looks kind of rough, Eric. It's not like the best piece. It's one of my very, very earliest pieces of digitizing because I found something where I could play with it at home for free. And it had literally all it had was point to point. But the thing is, when you look at it, you're like, all right, well, if I was to analyze this piece, I'd say, oh, well, somebody kind of did a junky job of this thing. At the same time, I can say, all right, well, what's that? Yeah, that's a satin stitch. It looks like it's got an edge run underlay. It's probably set at about this much border. Yeah, that's kind of weird. It's got a zigzag. Boy, he inset that way too far. Those are satin stitches as well with an edge run underlay, and they were all done probably using a column stitch. But if we actually look at the piece, you can see through some of the variation that I had. And believe me, this has been, I was working on, God, the whole monitor was probably 800 by 600. I don't know what the resolution was, but it was incredibly poor. Um, this piece was dropped one stitch at a time manually. Does it look a whole lot like other digitizing that was done in a way that wasn't manual? Absolutely, it does, because the ones that I had to look at before I could do my digitizing myself were all pieces that were done in software, and it looks a lot like those. But you're going to notice a couple of things that are dead giveaways to me. Certainly, you can see that I'm traveling. I'm doing a pretty good job. It looks like edge run underlay, doesn't it? Right? But there's some roughness there. I'm certainly not super careful. I didn't have the best way of looking at these pieces, and I'm dropping every single edge. You see some roughness. Maybe you could say that's just because the lines weren't drawn very well, but there's some oddness to it. And here's where we start getting into giveaway territory, though, right? Once I get this all put together, it looks like a standard satin, but there's a couple things that'll tell you for sure that it's a little weird. Number one, I have a nice big straight line, and for some reason I'm off and I'm crooked and weird. Yeah, that's not intentional. I just had issues with my input method and the software I was using. Also, most modern software, as we get into the inner corner of something like this, is going to draw short stitches. And I was young enough in the business that I didn't know that I was going to build up all this excess density on the inside edge of this piece. And so I just made sure that I drew stitches that followed an angle that I thought would make sense. So even though we can see the stitches, and this looks like a satin stitch with a straight stitch border, well, this was one of my very, very first things I ever touched. And I did it one stitch at a time, and very obviously didn't understand how to do short stitching. And so if I were looking at this thing under a density map, very obviously I've got some areas that are getting a little tight in here. You know, if you look at a wire line, we've got some real highlights, some tight spots in these corners. Are they crazy bad? No, it probably runs just fine. In fact, I know it runs just fine, but it is overly dense in the corners and isn't what you would really think of as the right way to handle a piece like this. But you can't tell that just from looking, right? That's not something just you can tell just from looking. And when we get further in my career, like I said, we can look at other pieces and see things like when we're looking at a piece that looks like it's all done with fills, and most of it is, but then we occasionally find things where it doesn't look like it could be or doesn't make sense. These little areas of manual light blue stitching, very obvious we're done manually. Why? We see this change of stitch angle jumping out in the middle of a block of stitches to do a stitch that it doesn't match at all with the rest of the patterns. And these kind of manual things you expect, and you can tell that maybe the only way to have done some of these connectors in between here, some of the shading that's here, a little harder to see on screen in the blues, but then there's other pieces that are very obviously done with fills. The thing is, when we're looking at a piece that may or may not be done manually, obviously it doesn't matter. Why? If I wanted to replicate this piece now, I know that I could use column tools to do it. So when people ask me, how was it made? How was it made is probably less important to a degree in comparison with how do we get the stitches that we're looking at? If you can get the same stitches with a fill tool, use them. If you can get the same stitches with a different tool, use them. Plus, easily you could say that all this shading or all of the outlines were here done manually one stitch at a time. Very close to it, because even when you're using something like a straight stitch tool that will give you a straight line and parse those stitches for you, when you have lots of different changes of angle, as we have in some of these cracks, you're essentially dropping every stitch manually anyway, because if you drop it underneath the normal length of the stitch, it's going to be point to point anyway when you drop that line. So the type of stitch is less important than how we can reproduce it. And how we can reproduce it is just looking at the qualities we have in each kinds of the stitches and then working from there, right? So, all right, let's finish that there. I'm going to go ahead and stay for the bonus time and give you the last little comment I have on patch making. First, I'm going to go ahead and go back for a comment from Mike. So we talked about the 100 ways of patch making Mike has, and let's talk to him about that too. He says, out of the 100 ways he likes to make patches. So I'll go back and list my ways of making patches and why you might want to use them real quick. But he says, okay, so out of the 100 ways, my two favorites are pop out with a faux marrow for shaped patches. Love that. So pop out using a plastic substrate. One of the pieces I'm going to show you, I did that with a Madeira badge film. It's a polyolefin film that you can rip the things out of. And he says traditional cutout and real marrow for simple shapes, tried and true. Love it. Love it. So classic ways to go. Though I am definitely a faux marrow guy because I don't generally have a marrow machine in a given place that I'm at. So it's access to tools for some degree for me. But here's the thing I'm going to show you real quick. First, I'm going to grab some images one more time and kind of bring this stuff up. The couple of patches I'm going to refer to here are these ones. So we have this piece here. This is the San Antonio police patch. It was done for a show called The Night Shift that was on NBC at one point. And this was the first one that I did for them, but we had a couple different options we ended up using for those folks to try and get things done. What you don't know about this piece is they wanted a very specific kind of olive drab that I could not get in a regular fabric. So the piece that you have back here is not olive drab fabric so much as it is a big piece of white twill that I had to sublimate overall with olive drab to get it run. So when you're doing things for that kind of setup, that's one of the options. One of the other options, which we did use at one point, and this color does not match as well. This is another piece that we were doing that worked out. This is a thread only patch. So this piece over here, we'll go back to this one. This is done by placing a pre-cut piece of polyester twill. We place it like an applique. In this case, it was done with a water-soluble material. So we stitched a placement stitch, and then we dropped this on, appliqued it on, did all of the detail work in the center, and then ran a border last, took it out of the hoop, clipped away the excess, and wash off the rest of the water-soluble material. You could have totally done that in a tearaway. The thing is, the pop-out method that Mike talked about, you could do that too. You can do um, patches of multiple kinds with multiple different substrates. So this piece was water soluble, but just as easily we could have done a plastic film. There's multiple kinds of this film that are being used, everything from the old school Walmart tablecloth plastic method, the 20 gauge method, to using the lovely Madeira textured polyolefin films. So those options are there. But in any case, you do it in an applique style. This is a pre-cut piece of material that's placed in a placement line, and then we applique around it and tear it out and either wash away or heat away the remainder of the material afterwards. But the main body of the patch is fabric. In this set of patches, and these are actually using two different methods, these are done with the pop-out method, but thread building. And what I mean by that is the background of this patch is built with thread. There is a mesh of thread run, and then the actual fabric of the patch, the background of the patch, is a tight fill over a mesh underlay. So we have a a tri-directional kind of mesh underlay with a fill on top of it, in this case going very vertically. And then we run all the rest of the details on it and run the border on it after the fact. But it is all thread. All of the piece that you're looking at is thread with it. Of course, the plastic badge film is still inside of it when we rip it away. But we run all of this border, we run the detail stuff, or we run all of this background, then the detail stuff, and then we run the final border on top of it and tear it away from that plastic substrate. And both of these were using different substrates. One was using a Madeira film that was for one of their systems, the MFS multifunctional system that makes emblems and applique material pieces. And this was done with the classic like Walmart plastic method, right? So those are both different methods that you can use to do that. The thing is, there's multiple different methods by which we can make them. And the big question we had isn't always like, how do we cut them, right? That's the first thing people talk about with patches, right? They usually have these different options where they're like, all right, Do you use soluble substrate to get your edge? So water or heat soluble, the pop out, or you cut and rinse away a water soluble? Are we using a hot cut method, which is either you do the entire edge or a portion of it, and then you use a hot knife, which is like a glorified wood burning tool, to cut around the outside edge, or to cut a blank out before we end up going to the final edging stage? Because we can do that too, is cut a blank out that is not edged and then run a marrow overlock machine on the outside edge to clean it up. So we either one of these, and then potentially using a marrow. Or do we use, like, that's the thing, we could be arguing between the marrow edge versus the embroider edge. Funny enough, you could use the pop out method and then marrow and edge. You could do the entire method up into the point and then do a marrowed edge if you wanted to, a traditional overlock if you had it. So it's either, are we talking about using these substrates or hot cut? Are we talking about using a true marrow? Are we talking about a faux embroidered edge of some kind, either a satin or a faux marrow edge? But the argument that I had with somebody was, it's not necessarily an argument, but a question that they wanted to ask me was, hey, why would anybody do a thread only patch? So I'm going to show you once again another thread only patch. I did a project for Embrilliance recently that we released as a free file. If you want to go check it out, it's over at embrilliance.com. I'll go ahead and show it to you so you can see what I'm talking about. But this piece is a customizable conversation heart piece, just a really simple thing. I've actually got the piece sitting here with me right now. So the actual piece is sitting in my hot little hand. But we can see this piece here, this Be Mine conversation heart. The file actually has an embedded text envelope, so you can change the lettering on it and you can change the style, but you can also change the execution style. This piece was done as thread only, right? So this is a thread only patch. It is built entirely out of a quartet of threads in pinks and reds to make this conversation heart. Now, this is the cutesy version. Believe me, my own personal version. I made some funny, salty ones myself as well, because those are always fun. The breakup conversation hearts are just as fun as the sweet ones, to me at least. So go punk with it if you want to go get that file for yourself. But the thing is, we can also use our interactive settings on this piece to decide either to create using pre-cut materials, to create in the hoop, to create with a light fill on top of pre-cut materials, or to create with fill, using fill, which is a thread-based patch. And the thing is, there are reasons why you might want to do it. And it's not just, hey, crafters have time on their hands, though that is part of it, right? We're looking at the actual piece. It's a decent looking little piece, and this is thread only. This is not necessarily what everybody else wants to do. When you're doing old school patch production on large volumes, using a material behind it makes a ton of sense, especially for people who have the tools and the access to make it make sense. Either pre-cutting with laser or a roll cutter makes a big difference to making this economical and useful, no matter what substrate you're using to get your edges, or using things like a clinker. You know what a clinker is? It's a die cutter where you put a die for a classic shape on top of the material, and then a press comes in and pushes the sharpened die through all the material at once, so you can make a ton of especially regular shaped patches. Very sensible to do the fabric method. And the thing is, there's no reason to think that you shouldn't be doing that. I like fabric patches too. But here's the deal: depending on who you're doing it for and why, there are reasons why you might want to use a thread only patch. And here's why I did. You saw that version that I showed you earlier. For me, it was color availability. I had to do it in a quick turnaround. If I need a patch today that has to be of a certain color and I can't find material for the patch that matches that color, however, I do have that color of thread on hand, and it's something that somebody is okay with the texture being different. The texture of a full fill looking a little bit different than a fabric piece, certainly, obviously, being a little bit heavier, perhaps, depending on how it was stitched or what the substrate is. For the color availability, it might make sense for me to do it for a quick turnaround, because for me, that falls within the value to the client. A client who wants a patch today for an event or for a shooting schedule for a movie or TV is paying you a lot more than a client who wants 1,000 patches of the same kind, especially classically shaped patches that aren't very difficult to make, and is willing to wait for a turnaround to be a little bit longer, is willing to wait for a piece done. That's more in the realm of traditional emblems and might make sense to do that. Now, other reasons you might want to use different textures that are not available in fabric. You might want to use thread to build them, or you might want to add that texture. You can still use fabric bases and then add that texture through light fills or through some other manipulation by adding some kind of filling process or other thread based texture on top of it. You can do that. But there is a reason why you might do thread only. And I think part of it is like the economy of labor too. People often make the comment, oh, it's because crafters don't have to worry about their time. Sure, but I'm going to be honest with you and say that there are times when The labor that I have to spend in actually touching it is the important thing. If I have time on the machine to allow, right? If I have that time on the machine available and that machine is going to lie fallow anyway, but I can, instead of myself having to operate a cutter or work on placement and sit at the machine, if I can, I hate to say set it and forget it because I always tell you guys to watch your machines, but if I'm doing full production, if I can set a machine loose and know that it's going to go through the entire process, and at the end I get a patch that I can just tear away, it might make sense to allow for that extra stitch count, and it would still be okay and valuable to me because the economy of labor makes sense. If I can go then do something more valuable with my time than cutting out patch blanks or placing them and being present for that part of the run, it might make sense for me to allow a thread-based patch. So the thing to understand is that there are hybrids all along the realm of this thing, and there are even things like sublimation and print that can come in that make more sense when the turnaround is more important than the texture. And that's another thing I certainly did. I mean, if we think about this kind of work, I showed you the couple of pieces I did for the movies that were done all thread, and the other thing I did was quite a few patches that were done entirely in sublimation. I think I've got some labeled here, and we do. So these were done once again. We had a shoot where we had multiple different, essentially dojos full of guys who were supposed to have gotten into an incident on the show, and we had to, within a single day, come up with essentially 8 individual patch sets that had a chest patch like this and had another name badge with them that were supposed to be martial arts badges. Now, I know that these might not be accurate whatsoever. I also know that jiu-jitsu, you're not allowed to use a lot of these things. You're not allowed to use patches like this, but for the movie casting people, that's what they wanted, right? In order to get them out in time, I sublimated these blanks and did a perfect cut satin stitch edge so they still looked like patches when they're sewn on, but from a little bit of a distance, the full color image was available and something that you could see. So what did I do? I printed the blanks ahead of time and then I placed the edges after the fact. And I'll be the first to say the edges are not perfect. The spacing is not perfect, but it was horseshoes and hand grenades and certainly good enough to get them through shooting and for these to look legitimately like patches, even though they didn't have the full embroidery. It allowed me to make 8 different sets for multiple people per set in a day in a way that I couldn't otherwise. And like I said with the other one here, the thread-based patch in this case, if I can do something else while it's running, it can still be worthwhile because it's an economy of labor. So it really just depends on what makes the most sense for the client. So value to the client is really what makes the most sense. And you're right, crafters are among those who might just say, "Hey, value of labor to me is I don't want to cut material. I don't want to have to cut and place and fiddle with applique style materials. Or let's imagine I don't have a cutter, which is pretty common in the world. I don't want to hand cut material either on a pre-made die that I have to put out or a pattern, or to go into the hoop and then do an applique style hand cut because those can be fiddly and difficult and give me a less quality edge if I miss the cut by some amount. Doing a thread based patch means I get a perfect edge every time. So these are arguments that make sense to me, right? I just think that that's why people use them. They are different reasons why you might do it, but it just depends, right? It just depends on what we're talking about. You can do them with different methods, but each of these methods has some viability in it. And I'm actually going to show you one more thing. I'm going to bring up the patch that I just showed you guys in just a second here ago. We're going to bring up that conversation heart patch and give you a concept of the other reason why it might not be so incredible to think, all right, I'm wasting so much time working on this piece. Well, if we bring up the file itself, so here is our conversation heart patch. This is the actual one. Fun thing about that is we can customize the lettering, and an envelope will bring it back into its shape. That's the cool thing. The other thing I showed you before is that we can customize the fill type on this thing, and we can customize the actual edge piece. So this isn't the actual one that's in the full interactivity. This is my original version, so it's actually even easier if you go download the piece. But we can see down here in this piece, I can actually look at my material and say, I want to create it with either hand cut pieces or pre-cut, or I'm going to cut it when it's finished, and it'll change the routine of what it does. This one right now is set to create using fill, which means it's going to do this stitch type. Now I'm going to go ahead and run through that stitch for you so you can just see what it looks like. It builds up this grid. There's that 3-layer grid on it. And then if we look at this, it does eventually go with a full density fill at the top. Then I went in and split this up so I could do a little bit of shading. I've got a slightly higher than half density shading run on this that I just did right on top. And then I did a border stitch. We've got a faux marrow edge being used with the edge stitch from Stitch Artist 3, or Marrowly is the similar edge stitch, but that's how it does the automatic cornering. And then we have a pretty heavy kind of stitching on top for the satins because I wanted it to stand up be able to have a lot of high contrast and have a little bit of loft to it. So it's pretty heavy. However, we're looking at this piece and you'll say, all right, I got roughly a 3-inch square patch. It's got 14,000 stitches in it. Yes, that's a lot of stitches. People are going to say, man, that's pretty heavy. Sure, it's the entire piece isn't completely filled with shading, with a satin border on that piece, and it absolutely is pretty heavy. I'm not going to lie and say it's not heavy. It's supposed to stand on its own as an object. It has to be a patch when we're done with this thing. But okay, 14,000 stitches, sure. Now, if I made the very same piece, and this is the same piece with a preview method of having this the stitching on it, right? This is done with applique material. We have a stitching and we have it tacked down. So this is tacked down with the pre-cut applique material. The shading is done just like it was done on the other piece. Nothing else has changed aside from that. Here's our foam marrow edge. Here's our text, still done pretty heavily, but yeah, here's our full text piece just as we had in the other piece. What's my stitch count now? About 67 or about 7,000. So yeah, admittedly, yes, it is about half the stitching. It's not 14, it's 7,000, not 14,000. However, if we think about running, even if we had 8,000 stitches that we were saving, we're not quite there, but let's say we're close to 8,000 stitches, we're running at 800 stitches a minute, we're saving 10 minutes. And you'll say, man, that's a massive difference in the run. Yes, it is. But if we're doing small run, and let's say that I have to take this thing out, mount up material, cut it on a cutter, I'm only doing a few pieces on this thing, I think you'd have to look at this and go, all right, if there's going to be extra work on the outside edge, maybe I have to do cleanup or hot cut. If there's going to be a lot of extra work in the cutting, let's say I don't have access to a cutter and I'm cutting these by hand ahead of time, I'm not saying it would be a wash, but it gets closer and closer. That 10 minutes, that 8 to 10 minutes we might save, depending on the speeds that we're running, it gets closer and closer to being a wash for people. And I can at least say that even though it seems massive, there are cases like this when it might not be that massive. Now, personally, I like the look of this too, and I think it'd be interesting to have the texture. I would also very much consider using a partial fill on this and still have some texture to it. So let's say I wanted some partial fill on this. It's entirely possible that I would say create using a light fill. And if I did add a light fill to that, or use the advanced light fill, then I would just have a somewhat less, like a much less dense fill that just adds some texture instead of building the entire patch. Then it's even less difference if I wanted that as textural quality there. Then we're talking about 9,000 stitches, almost 10,000. We're only saving about 4. We're not saving much depending on how you go into trying to create your texture. Um, is this always the case? No. But what I'm saying is it's not always a travesty to run those extra stitches. It can be for me if I was doing this commercially and making 1,000 of these things. I'm very likely using lighter fills in general, lighter construction in general, and using fabric to make the background. But I can totally see if you're making a few of these for craft table personalization, or even let's say we're doing a team and each one of these is individually made for each person on said team. I can fully imagine running these things in thread so we have the right colors, so we're not purchasing materials, so we're not doing pre-cuts and running them out, even in a commercial setting. When we get to the smallest level of small run, we have to run our prices in a way that makes sense for margin, but it also means that we can look at our production and say, all right, scale of labor, cost of materials, cost of sourcing, cost of labor in prepping materials that's not just on machine, not just in the embroidery process, may or may not make sense to you. So, like I said, you have to look for yourself at what the stitch counts are and how they change. Individual patches will be different. This one had some fill stitch shading on top. If this was just lettering on a big oval, then very much would have been a different world, especially if I could get myself some pre-made patch blanks for that. But I'm just going to say that the thread-based patches aren't necessarily entirely anathema to doing this as a commercial venture, necessarily. Would I do it all the time? No. Have I used them in the commercial world? Absolutely, I have, especially for that whole concept of doing one-offs. And when we're talking about things like the Merrily automation, where I can bring up a shape, tell it to run, and I'm not doing anything aside from setting a couple settings. Yeah, that's an argument that I'm willing to have about trying to produce, let's say, cut files and nesting a big set of cuts and everything else if I'm only doing a few pieces. So if we're in that sub 10 level of pieces, we're doing 4 or 5 pieces, there's more of an argument there. And like I said, if it's color availability with like a really quick turnaround, sometimes you just have a much better thread palette than you have a collection of fabrics. Now, if you're a patch house, you make patches all day long, and you've got a random number of colors that's going to be more likely to fulfill what a customer needs on the average day, even that might not stop you. And if you're ready for that, you probably also are very quick at putting together cut files and things like that. Now, and the other lovely thing is if your software does as Embrilliance does, where you can use things like a placement line to automatically create a cut file, then it's more trivial to you. But if you're not, you may be out in vector software drawing cut file lines. And if you're doing that or nesting up a sheet, we now have extra labor that if we factor it all in, might be a wash on a really small run. So it depends. Like I said, look at the stitches for yourself, look at the counts for yourself, and decide where you want to put your labor. Do you want it in finishing? Do you want it on the lead end? Or do you want that to be done by your friendly embroidery robot while you do something else? It might end up that economy is different depending on the kind of creator you are. A big bad shop is doing it traditional probably all day long. Somebody in a real small shop or a sole proprietor or a boutique shop, I can totally see using thread-based patches to make that happen. All right, folks. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up with a couple comments and then let you all go for the day. Uh, Cindy King says, I like the wash away, but it sure gets messy. Yeah, wash away makes a really great edge, but it is gloopy and you have to really rinse it all out and you have to let things dry. So wash away is not for everybody. I like the way it looks, but I have to say I'm using more of what we call the pop out, tear away plastic method. Like I said before, Madeira has a lovely film, a textured polyolefin film, 2 layers of that. In fact, this patch that I made, now I'll show it to camera again. This patch that I made that you saw on the piece, and the camera's kind of not picking up the greatest version of this, but I can actually show it in the post as well, probably real quick. We'll bring that post back up over at Embrilliance.com. It's on the front page right now if you want it. So Embrilliance.com is the easiest way to get to it. This piece was made on 2 layers of that polyolefin film that they have. So look for their badge film, and it does just tear away when you're done. Run your border last if you're running on that plastic kind of film because it holds up a little less. You'll see how it's put together if you look at the file. I actually put it together in such a way where I separate my border as a separate piece from the initial fill run. You can do them as one piece, but I like to do the borders last. It's just my preference, and so I made the patch, so I use my preferences. But yeah, the borders are a great way to go. And honestly, I think that it's worthwhile to use the polyolefin film these days because it really you tear it away. There's a little bit of fuzz on the edge, and if you're a caveman like me, you use a lighter sometimes and you're running around the outside edge. Safer forms of heat exist, so don't be me. Use heat guns, use safer forms of heat to melt that edge. Use your iron to melt the edge. But I had some little fuzzies and I ran a lighter around the outside edge, and that's just the truth. But I like to tell the truth. I tell on myself all the time. But yeah, Joanne says, Walmart plastic, do you have another video where you explain that? Yeah, I think I do. There is a patch making video. If not, there is an article online. Go look for my article on patches at ericcampbell.com. It does explain how to make the plastic patches. Tons of people have explained it, but it really is a fairly similar process. And in fact, if you look at the instruction guides on any of the patches from Merrily, we also explain the plastic patch method there too. At some point, I'll have to do a direct video step by step. And honestly, that's probably something that's coming in the future here because I want to talk more about it and do some cool multimedia patches sometime soon. So Cindy King says, I just got her own cutter, so I'm excited to try pre-cutting my patch. Usually I do more like applique. Yeah, pre-cut slots. That's what I did. For me, I'll be honest with you too and just tell you my products that I usually use. Back in the day, it was a Graph Tech cutter, previous to that a Roland, and I did a regular roll-fed cutter with the pressure-sensitive poly twill from Stahls. However, what I'm going to tell you is the pressure-sensitive poly twill from Stahls is shiny and not everybody loves it. So I know tons of people who cut differently. Often they will use matte style cutters like the Cricut, or if they're lucky, they find an old like IO Line 300 that has kind of the glue trace system, and they will cut a much more normal polyester twill that doesn't have that sheen on it. But back in the day when I had to make them fast, I was using that pressure sensitive because it came on a roll on a carrier, very much like heat press vinyl. And we just used a 60-degree cutter blade to do it. So standard vinyl cutting blade can be used to cut that material. I still would use it today, but you will see lots of people who do use that and don't like that shine. Putting like a low density fill on top of it, even when you're just covering the background in a similar color, just to knock down that texture because it's so shiny. Not everybody loves the super shine. Lasers are fantastic. I don't have one right now. The guys who do have them use them to great effect, and I would love to use one both for pre-cutting and post-cutting I've seen, but that's something I haven't done. The other thing you can always do, run everything, including the border, through the entire stack of material with the polyester span, and then use the hot knife, which is like a wood burning pen, to trace the edge and cut through that material. Just be careful about how you cut, and you'll have to develop your hand. It takes some practice to do the hot knife. Glass on the table, patch on the glass, cut carefully around the outside borders. There's plenty of videos out there. The folks from Coleman and Company always show it. Their patch kit is really where a lot of people learned that back in the day. We also have a couple more comments. Joanne says, "Love the dimensional look of that heart." Thank you. Glad you like it. Lots of people saying some other stuff about how they like it. Joanne says, "Wondering if the heat away film is sturdy enough for the pop out process." Depending on the heat away film, there's two kinds. The thicker 100 millimeter is the stuff that we're talking about. There's not 100 millimeter, 100 nanometer. Like I can't remember the measurements on it. There's 30 and 100, and I'm saying it incorrectly now that I'm my brain is freezing at the end of the show. But there is a thicker material. The thicker material, you want to use a couple layers of that, and it does hold up. Also, remember, if you're talking about the last portion of it, is it okay after you're done with it or after you've made the piece? You can do this on water soluble. I've made patches like this entirely on water soluble. They're very thin when you're done, but you can wash it entirely out because the thread itself makes a textile. It makes a fabric. So when you are done with this piece, you could do full water soluble. If you use the kind of heavier stuff and a couple layers of it that looks like standard cutaway stabilizer, the material looking, the fabric like water soluble. I have absolutely run a patch on that and just washed it entirely out. It is much thinner, and you're probably going to want to adhere it to something, stitch it down, or use like heat adhesive or a patch sealing film on the back if you want it to have any sort of stiffness. Whereas this one right here is fairly stiff, and it was done on 2 layers of the heavier gauge heat away. So not the thin stuff. There's stuff that is made for badges. Like I said, I've used the Madeira kind. I haven't used everybody else's, but go check that out. Madeira is where I got mine from. So Madeira USA is where I got mine from. I'd have to go look again. Like I said, there is a thicker and a thinner kind. The thicker kind is made for badges, and it should say so on the piece. I'll have to look it up for you, but we are so far into bonus time that I'm going to cut this out here. So anyway, suffice it to say, yeah, Marcos doing the same thing. Have an eye line just sitting here and use the vinyl cutter to cut my shapes for patches. Absolutely. Uh, we have just picked up an IO line cutter this week. Can't wait to use it. Yes, man, the 300 is cool. I want to get an old school one too. I love that stuff. Though the roll cutters are fantastic. Absolutely. Cindy says, I've done all the regular ways, just want to try something new. Try it. Yeah. And honestly, the cool thing about the thread based patches is you can get a little wild with them because you don't really have to worry about the cutting. You can do different kind of shape stuff with them. Um, it's essentially kind of like a fully covered 3D lace product. It's kind of like that. It's like a dimensional lace product. I hate to tell you that, but the funny thing is we look at these different processes, especially, and I'll believe this is my last thought. We look at these places and kind of say, okay, this comes from the craft world and this comes from the commercial world and this is more of this is more of that. If we isolate it and stop and go, hey, what does it do? The knockdown mesh fill that originally was very craft world became something that we used a lot in the commercial world for knits and heavy substrates. Um, and it's very similar to things we do. The way we work on lace, so lace work and freestanding lace is very similar to what we do to make these badges now. And I see this originally, when I first learned the plastic method, I learned it on a commercial system from Madeira, not from a home market piece. So everybody's like, "Oh, plastic patches, that's a home market." No, I learned it using the MFS system from Madeira with commercial instructions that I then refined after the fact. So this is a continuum. Just like when we're talking about analyzing stitches, look at how it functions and worry about the tools after the fact. Look at what the stitches are doing and think about how the tools you have can create what you want the stitches to do. So, no matter how you're making your patches or how you want to wear your heart on your sleeve and say, I'm commercial, I'm craft, ultimately you're doing embroidery. The thread is the same, the structure is the same, the physics are the same. And if we understand what it is we want things to do and how things are built, we can get down to elemental essential level and build up whatever we want. All right, folks. So I'm going to let that go. It is incredibly late, super long bonus time, but I'm super happy you guys were here. We'll get back into this again. I probably should have been 2 shows this time around, but we'll go back. We'll talk about patch stuff again sometime because I always love making them. But I hope you go check that out. If you want this patch, go over to embrilliance.com. You can get that. And using our free, you don't have to have the full Embrilliance software to make one of these. Get the free download, use the express mode. There's directions on the bottom, and you can output it in any stitch file format you want for whatever machine. And then you can try it yourself, and with whatever method you like. And you can put little weird salty messages on it. I won't I won't turn you in. Just tag me in if you put something real funny on it. All right. All right, folks. With that, hopefully you learned something today. Go look at a bunch of embroidery. Look at some retro stuff. Look at some new stuff. Look at some fashion stuff. Get on that zoomed in detail level of the picture and make some notes and try and make something cool. And if you do, hey, show me. I want to see some cool new stuff. All right, folks. With that, had a great time talking with you this week, and I can't wait to see you again next time.